Okay, hey everybody, welcome to an episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today, a very cool review for you guys from the brand Hanhart. Originally founded back in Switzerland in 1882, then later relocated to Germany in 1902, they are best known for their historic pilot chronographs. Now, in terms of pilot's watch, as well as chronographs and key common characteristics and design language, when you're looking for something within this space, of course, you're going to find that general balance of both legibility and functionality on the pilot's watch side. And in terms of chronographs, of course, you're going to find external pushers to activate timing functions with multiple subdials to measure elapsed time, often featuring additional scales dependent on the subgenre. This is their 415 ES Reverse Panda, and this model is based on the basic design of the historic 415 ES and combines this with modern technology and sporty design elements. The watch features a black dial with white totalizers. This goes for about $3,400 US, and that is with VAT, or around $3,100 without VAT. But of course, now with the tariffs, it can vary quite a bit, and that is configured as you see here on bracelet. This sample was actually kindly sent in by the Hanhart brand for the purpose of this review. But of course, all of the thoughts are my own, and they don't receive any type of editorial input or privilege or peer review along the creating process. Now, yes, not a cheap watch, but not the most expensive when you think about the heritage one that Hanhart has, as well as the specs. When you consider the fact that this is one of their newer models that do get that very nice toolless micro adjusting clasp, as well as the fact that this does have 100 meters of water resistance, sapphire glass. You're also going to be getting a beautiful ceramic insert, to name a few of the niceties here that typically you might pay a little something extra for if you were shopping with other German brands. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get this piece in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, guys, now, obviously if you're fans of the channel, you'd probably find it weird if I didn't compare it to this bad boy right here, my 417 ES 1954 Flyback Panda. Now, of course, this is going to have a bit, it's funny enough, both of these watches do their kind of own little mixing of old and new, and I think these actually play off of each other really well. So even though I own this model and I love it, it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be able to enjoy this particular model. Of course, you're getting normal Panda, reverse Panda. Then in terms of the bezel there, you're going to get this friction fit bidirectional kind of coin edge bezel, versus here you're going to have a more traditional 60-minute timing bezel. But as you can see, the dimensions are pretty much identical. So we'll jump right into those dimensions. 39 millimeters across, 13.3 millimeters thick, which is quite thin for a mechanical chronograph, and then just 45.5 millimeters lug to lug. Stainless steel construction, brushed with polished accents here. Not too many polished points. Let me give them a quick little wipe. It's really just going to be those nice high polished bevels there across the tops of the lugs. Now, getting into some other details, you're going to have this beautiful box dome sapphire with an inner anti-reflective coating, as well as this surprisingly, maybe it shouldn't be surprising because Hanhart they do things right, but man, this 60-minute bidirectional bezel is very snappy. It makes me wonder what the bezel action on their dive watches are like. So Hanhart, if you're listening, I think you might have just won me over enough to want to check out one of your divers, which I really just see Hanhart for this glorious German pilot watch brand. Not really was ever interested in their divers, but I'll say this action is so dialed in. Oh my. I cannot overstate how good this bezel action is. Very, very cool. 60 clicks, bidirectional rotating, and it does have a ceramic inlay. And I will say, in person, the ceramic inlay is impressive. It is matte finished there, and it just feels expensive. I have to say, in pictures, you can't really tell, but I will say in person, in practice, it feels quite expensive. And don't get me wrong, $3,400 is not cheap, but by any means. But at the same time, if you are a fan of mechanical chronographs with heritage, you will realize very quickly that this is actually a pretty screaming deal. Now, the crown is push-pull, although you are going to get that 100 meters of water resistance or 10 atmospheres that is going to be water resistant in terms of a DIN 8310 compliancy there, which is quite nice. Now, the movement inside, although you can't see it behind this solid case back, which also shares that Heritage Wings Hanhart logo. If we can get it to focus here, give it 1 second. Boom. Check that out. Boom, boom, boom. So you do have quite a few logos there. And of course, again, they have that signature Wings logo. So very cool in terms of a bit of a throwback, but still is something a little bit different. Of course, this one also had a Heritage logo, but not the Wing logo. This is like the original old school logo. Then here we have one of their more contemporary logos that's still, of course, considered one of their heritage logos. It's just a little bit newer. Now, the movement inside, although you can't see it, is going to be your mechanical Sellita SW510M. And it is a manual wind movement with a 58-hour power reserve. It does have 4 hertz sweep, or beating at 28,800 vibrations per hour in terms of that beat rate, which is quite nice. But here's the difference between the 417 and the 415. You're going to see here, flyback status. So this is going to have a flyback movement. Quite a bit more expensive typically, guys, versus the more standard setup where essentially you stop it and you reset it. You can't let it run, and then there's no snapping back there. So this is not a flyback movement. So it is going to be a little bit cheaper though because of that. And I will say that is awesome that you can have something like this be a little bit cheaper and you're not having to downgrade to some acrylic crystal or some aluminum insert or some, clasp that isn't going to be up to the same level here as this very modern toolless micro adjusting clasp. Now, getting into the dial details here, guys, this thing is very monochromatic and minimalistic, and I really like that. I know some of you might be thinking, oh man, I wish Mark would have reviewed the Panda dial version, not the Reverse Panda. I don't know, guys. There's something about this Reverse Panda layout that I really enjoy. It speaks to me and it just feels very versatile. It's kind of in that vein of something like an Omega Speedmaster or a Rolex Daytona, Zenith El Primero. It just has that kind of classic vibe to it, and I appreciate that. Something like a Sinn 103 ST. So I like that. I like that a lot. Now, you're going to get, of course, the matte black dial. You're going to get that historical Wing logo, as well as white syringe hands with bent down tips there. So you can see for accuracy, I think that is very neat that they went with that. So very, very cool. All matted out. Again, nothing glossy. It has definitely a working finish to it. You're going to have matte white subdials that do glow, as well as contrasting black hands, which is great because that means in the dark you're going to be able to see the hands over the glow of those subdials. And speaking of the glow, it's going to be Swiss Superluminova C1 GLX2 in terms of the particular formula. So this should be able to glow quite nicely. Again, 100 meters of water resistance, 20 millimeter lug width. Very nice. And then it's going to taper down to about 16 millimeters. It has a screw pin construction, very beautifully done. And it does have this newer clasp, which is quite nice. And they're not the first brand to ever use this clasp, but I will say it is a good choice. I'm glad they didn't try to reinvent the wheel and create something that was ultimately not as good as this, which I will say is the case for the Sinn version of this, or even the Seiko version of the toolless micro adjusting clasp extension. I really like this. It has 6 positions of ratcheting toolless micro adjustment. You press the button, you pull it out, and then you click it back down. And you can see when it's fully extended, it is not an eyesore. I will say from the side, it's not as attractive, but top down, you're rarely even gonna notice that. So very nice, very solid. And then, of course, you do have push button. And the clasp itself is a bit thicker because it is fully milled. So this is going to be about 18.5 millimeters wide versus here on the more traditional clasp that I have, not going to be quite as wide. It's just going to fit and be quite a bit slimmer in terms of the taper. It still has the milled folding section, but then this outer section is just, honestly, I believe is stamped. Whereas here, you're going to get fully milled all the way around. You're going to get that little extra bit of thickness there, and I like it. So with that said, let's actually get this piece on the wrist and see how it wears. Okay guys, as you can see on my 7.5 inch wrist, this wears just about perfectly. Now, if you don't know how big 7.5 inches are, it's 19 centimeters in circumference, but you'll also notice, although it is on the larger side of average, it's also quite a tall and round wrist and not necessarily a flat, wide, and accommodating one. Now, of course, if I get my wrist a bit too close to the camera lens, you're going to notice quite a bit of perspective distortion. All of a sudden, the watch seems larger comparable to my wrist. But if I keep my wrist nice and low and then just tighten up the frame like this, you're going to notice that all of a sudden you're going to get still a detailed look, but just add a bit of a truer aspect ratio as to how this may lay on your own wrist. And does it lay nicely? Look at that. Trim and tapered, beautifully sculpted and accented there. Nice robust bracelet. I think in terms of the proportions of the thickness there of the bracelet, it just feels quite solid. I love that classic taper. And again, this is a mechanical chronograph, and it even has a box dome sapphire, and it's still quite svelte, which I can appreciate. And don't get me wrong, it's kind of like cars, right? You gotta love a good SUV. Sometimes it sits a little higher, or a truck, but everybody loves a low slung sporty car. So when you do have something that wears low slung like this, it's impressive. And then when you think, oh, this actually has some some off-road capability, all right, you think of like those really cool rally kind of kitted out 911s that are like ready for the dunes, and they're ridiculous, but it's kind of that cool idea of you can kind of have it all, right? You can have something that feels bold and robust, but at the same time feels quite refined and stylish and sleek. So I like that. I think it is very cool. And yeah, this is just a handsome watch. Now, of course, without any real signature pops of color or anything like that. Some of you might find this a bit boring, but some of you might think that's the whole point. I want it to be boring. And, because the most classic watches that are out there are quite boring overall. But they're also some of the most versatile and timeless pieces. And of course, from a brand like Hanhart, I think it's not just the design alone, but then a bit of the gravitas that you're going to get from a brand that's so storied in terms of their horological significance over the years, even just their significance within pop culture, considering that, icons like Steve McQueen wore Hanhart watches. I think that is just really, really cool. So with that said, we'll get this piece now off the wrist, set up for some Lume shots, low light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. Hey, check that Lume out. Now, this is a pilot's watch. Does it need to be this potent? Probably not in most cases, but you know what? I did recently have some feedback from actual modern aviators who did mention that in a blacked out cockpit, Lume is incredibly useful. So I think that's awesome, and I think that you guys can tell here that the Lume is quite potent, and you're going to get, again, that very high level of legibility. But one thing I always like to work in is going to be a bit of a low light transition, because you're not always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it's nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. And my goodness, guys, of course, yes, the matte features, the satin features, they are going to blend and they're going to look quite professional and clean and even a bit sterile. But my goodness, look at the consistency there. Just the well thought out design. And of course, the execution is amazing, right? You're getting that German craftsmanship. But the actual design ethos, just for me, it just crosses over into this kind of very timeless space. I really, really like the look of this. And again, I love that for the money, you could have something like this historically significant, handsome, and really well spec'd at the end of the day. It used to be you had few options that could offer you something that is going to be so timeless like this. Yeah, when you think about things like the Omega Speedmaster. And I just think that something like this, again, it's in a similar breath when you think about something with that level of longevity. Of course, it doesn't have quite the same iconography or pop culture impact, but my goodness, this thing is handsome. Those who know will know, and those who don't know will still be able to appreciate something that just looks really, really well executed, very clean. The full Arabic numerals, the spacing, it's just very symmetrical, even down to, of course, the full indexing for that 60-minute bezel insert. So very, very cool here. Get the lights back on. And now let's get into some closing thoughts. On the wrist, guys, this wears perfectly. Some of you might be thinking 39mm with a turning bezel and information like subdials on there. It shouldn't work. It will feel crowded. I'll say you're wrong. I'm very surprised that a 39mm watch with a turning bezel, and that's a chronograph, somehow feels this well spaced. There's a beautiful breadth and negative space to this dial. It doesn't feel overly large or expansive. It feels beautifully balanced, trim, tight, and purposeful. So I do like that. I think visually the balance is great. And of course, on the wrist, physically, the balance is also quite nice. It is also, one thing to note, definitely thinner for a mechanical chronograph. Guys, I've reviewed quite a few mechanical chronos here on the channel as of late, and this is on the thin side. And I can deal with thicker chronographs because it's kind of the nature of the beast, especially when you start getting into chronographs that also serve a dual purpose, like having water resistance. Here, you're going to still get water resistance, right? But you're also going to maintain a fair amount of thinness, especially when you consider the fact that it does have a box dome sapphire. So if they would have went with flat sapphire, it could have been even thinner, which is just wild to me. In terms of comparable models, guys, mechanical chronographs typically are not cheap, especially from brands with any level of heritage. For example, like I mentioned before, similarly spec'd Sinn 103 ST will run you around $3,800. So that's quite a bit of a markup, and it's not necessarily a one-to-one in terms of like, hey, what is better? Like, there are some trade-offs there in terms of what many people might prefer in terms of specs or design. So guys, for me, bottom line here, much like the excellent 39mm 417 ES 1954 Flyback Panda that I own and showed you guys a bit earlier, this 39mm 415 ES Reverse Panda just hits all the right notes. It comes together, and I like that. And yes, individually and in terms of if you break down each facet of its design or execution, it's comprised of things that work, that are well executed and handsome. But I think as a whole, the way everything comes together is even more special. So with all that said, let me know what you all think down in the comments below. If you like the video, please like, and if you're ready, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.